The building felt different at night, as if it exhaled once the last daytime employee left. Ethan noticed this every time he signed in for the graveyard shift. The lights hummed softly above empty corridors, and the polished floors reflected his footsteps back at him like quiet reminders that he was alone. Night duty paid better, but it demanded a certain kind of endurance, one that thrived on silence and routine. Ethan had learned to move slowly through those hours, measuring time by coffee refills and security checklists. At 35, Ethan told himself he had chosen this schedule for practical reasons. Mark worked days, and the overlap helped with rent. That explanation sounded reasonable when spoken aloud, yet it ignored the deeper truth Ethan rarely confronted. His relationship with Mark had grown distant long before the night shifts began. Conversations had turned efficient, affection optional, silence familiar. Love, Ethan realized, could fade not with arguments, but with neglect. That he often thought of Mark during the quietest hours, usually around 2 in the morning when the world felt paused. Mark would be asleep then, his phone face down, unanswered messages waiting until morning. Ethan never accused him of anything concrete, because there was nothing obvious to accuse. No betrayal. No shouting. Just absence. Emotional absence had a way of hollowing a person out without leaving visible damage. Daniel entered Ethan's nights without announcement. He was the security guard assigned to the building's perimeter, a steady presence Ethan noticed only after several shifts had passed. Daniel was a few years older, broad-shouldered, with a calm expression that never seemed rushed. He walked the halls with quiet confidence, greeting Ethan with a nod at first, then a brief smile. Their early exchanges were professional and brief, limited to reports and check-ins. One night, during a scheduled round, Daniel stopped near Ethan's desk and asked if the coffee machine was still working. The question was simple, but it lingered longer than it should have. Ethan offered him a cup, apologizing for its bitterness. Daniel laughed softly, accepting it anyway. That laugh, unforced and warm, settled somewhere unexpected in Ethan's chest. From then on, their conversations became part of the night's rhythm. They spoke about work, about how strange the building felt after midnight, about how people underestimated the weight of quiet jobs. Daniel listened when Ethan spoke, really listened, without glancing at his phone or interrupting to fill the silence. It surprised Ethan how rare that had become in his life. Ethan didn't think of what he felt as attraction, not at first. It was comfort. Recognition. Daniel remembered small things, how Ethan took his coffee, how he preferred the East Wing patrol because it felt less claustrophobic. These details mattered more than Ethan wanted to admit. Each remembered preference felt like proof that he existed beyond obligation. At home, the contrast grew sharper. Mark answered questions politely but vaguely. When Ethan mentioned Daniel in passing, Mark barely reacted. The indifference stung more than jealousy would have. Ethan began to realize that what hurt most wasn't the lack of passion, but the lack of curiosity. Mark no longer asked about his nights. During one particularly slow shift, the building lost power for several minutes. Emergency lights flickered on, casting long shadows across the walls. Ethan and Daniel stood near the security desk, listening to the low hum of generators coming alive. In that dimness, the silence felt heavier, intimate. Daniel broke it gently. "Working nights can mess with your head," he said. "You okay doing this alone?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He opened his mouth to answer with something casual, something practiced, but the words stalled. No one had asked him that in a long time. Not sincerely. He settled for a nod, though it felt incomplete. Daniel didn't push. He simply stood there, sharing the moment until the lights returned and the building resumed its artificial glow. When Daniel walked away to continue his patrol, Ethan felt an unexpected absence, as if something important had just passed through his night and left a mark behind. As Ethan finished his shift hours later, he understood that nothing tangible had happened, and yet something had shifted. The night no longer felt neutral. It felt charged with possibility and risk. He drove home knowing that whatever he was beginning to feel, it had the power to change things, whether he wanted it to or not. The nights grew familiar in a way that unsettled Ethan. What had once been empty hours now felt shaped by expectation. He found himself anticipating Daniel's footsteps in the hallway, the soft radio crackle announcing another completed patrol. This awareness disturbed him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle. Desire did not arrive loudly, it arrived disguised as routine. Daniel and Ethan began sharing their breaks without planning them. One would arrive at the security desk with coffee, the other already waiting. Their conversations deepened, drifting from work complaints into reflections about choices and missed chances. Daniel spoke carefully, as if measuring which parts of himself were safe to reveal. Ethan responded with equal caution, though he felt a growing urge to speak honestly. One night, Daniel mentioned a relationship that had ended years earlier. He didn't give names or details, only the feeling of having invested in someone who stopped seeing him. "It's strange," Daniel said, staring at the dark hallway, "how you can be loyal and still feel abandoned." The word struck Ethan with uncomfortable precision. He recognized his own life in that sentence and wondered if Daniel recognized it too. At home, Ethan's patience with Mark thinned. He caught himself listening less, responding slower, retreating inward. Mark noticed the change, though he misunderstood its source. He accused Ethan of exhaustion, of letting work consume him. Ethan didn't correct him. Explaining would require admitting something Ethan hadn't fully named yet. Silence felt safer than clarity. The emotional line, once distant, crept closer each night. Ethan found himself replaying conversations with Daniel long after his shift ended. He imagined responses he hadn't said, questions he wanted to ask. None of these thoughts were physical, but they were intimate in a way that felt more dangerous. He was sharing pieces of himself with someone who was not his partner, and he knew it. One evening, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Rain battered the windows, and thunder echoed through the building. Daniel and Ethan found themselves confined to the security desk longer than usual, waiting for the worst of it to pass before resuming patrols. The storm narrowed the world to that small space, amplifying every pause in their conversation. Daniel admitted he sometimes took night shifts to avoid going home to an empty apartment. "It's easier to be needed here," he said quietly. Ethan understood that logic too well. Work offered structure without vulnerability, purpose without rejection. In that moment, their shared loneliness felt like a bridge, not a warning. The closeness reached a point that unsettled Ethan deeply. Sitting beside Daniel, aware of the storm and the quiet, he sensed how easy it would be to cross a line without meaning to. Not through touch, but through confession. He stopped himself, offering a neutral comment instead, retreating from the edge he had approached. Daniel noticed the shift and accepted it without question, though a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. At home the following morning, Mark confronted Ethan about his distance. The conversation was brief and unsatisfying. Mark asked if there was someone else. Ethan said no, and the answer was technically true. Yet the lie rested in what he withheld. Mark accepted the explanation, but his doubt lingered in the silence that followed. That night at work, Ethan kept his interactions with Daniel brief and professional. The effort felt unnatural, as though he were erasing something important. Daniel responded with polite restraint, mirroring the distance. The absence of warmth confirmed what Ethan had been avoiding. Their connection had mattered, and pulling away hurt both of them. As the shift ended, Ethan sat alone at the desk, the storm long gone, the building quiet once more. He realized that emotional boundaries were not protected by good intentions alone. They required honesty and choice. Ethan had delayed both, and the cost was beginning to surface. Whatever happened next, he understood, would demand a decision he could no longer postpone. Ethan reached a breaking point on a morning that felt indistinguishable from the ones before it. He lay awake beside Mark, staring at the ceiling while the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The weight in his chest was no longer vague or manageable. It had a shape now, defined by avoidance and half-truths. Ethan understood, with a clarity he could not ignore, that he had already crossed a line. Nothing physical had happened, but loyalty had eroded in quieter ways. That evening, Ethan asked Mark to talk. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the space between them filled with years of unspoken disappointment. Ethan chose his words carefully, admitting his loneliness and his need for connection. He spoke about feeling unseen, about drifting while pretending everything was fine. Mark listened without interrupting, his expression steady but tired. When Ethan finished, Mark confessed that he had felt the same distance but lacked the courage to address it. Their relationship, they realized, had been sustained by habit rather than intention. The conversation ended without raised voices or blame. They agreed that continuing as they were would only deepen the quiet resentment between them. Letting go felt painful, but honest. When Mark left the apartment that night, Ethan felt grief, relief, and guilt in equal measure. Ending the relationship did not erase the choices Ethan had made, but it allowed him to face them without deception. Returning to work after the separation felt surreal. The building was unchanged, yet Ethan moved through it differently. He avoided Daniel at first, unsure how to exist around him without the protective layer of denial. Daniel sensed the distance immediately. His greetings became formal, his conversations brief. The absence of their shared ease felt heavier than their previous closeness. Eventually, Daniel approached Ethan near the end of a shift. His voice was calm, but his eyes held concern. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked. The question was direct, leaving no space for evasion. Ethan realized that avoiding honesty would only repeat the patterns he was trying to escape. They spoke in the quiet corridor, the building nearly asleep. Ethan admitted that his relationship had ended and that he needed distance to understand himself. He did not confess feelings or assign responsibility. He simply told the truth as it stood. Daniel listened, nodding slowly, his disappointment evident but restrained. He thanked Ethan for being honest, even if the honesty arrived late. In the days that followed, their interactions settled into a respectful distance. The warmth remained, but it was contained, shaped by boundaries rather than impulse. Ethan missed the intimacy they had shared, yet he recognized that longing alone was not a reason to act. Growth, he realized, often meant resisting what felt immediately comforting. With time, the night shifts became quieter again. Ethan used the solitude to reflect rather than escape. He acknowledged his mistakes without self-pity and allowed himself to learn from them. Emotional neglect, he understood now, could be as damaging as overt betrayal, both to others and to oneself. On his final night at the building, before transferring to a different schedule, Ethan shared a brief farewell with Daniel. There were no dramatic declarations, only mutual respect and a sense of closure. Daniel wished him well, and Ethan returned the sentiment sincerely. Their story remained unresolved in a romantic sense, but complete in its lesson. As Ethan walked out into the early morning light, he carried the knowledge that change rarely arrives cleanly. It emerges through discomfort, through choices made too late or just in time. The night had altered him, not by giving him something new, but by revealing what he had been avoiding. And that awareness, he knew, would shape every relationship that followed. The weeks after Ethan's schedule change passed slowly, marked by unfamiliar mornings and quieter thoughts. Daylight exposed parts of his life he had avoided under the cover of night. Without the constant hum of late shifts, he found himself confronting silence of a different kind, the kind that demanded reflection rather than endurance. He missed the structure of the nights, but he did not miss the confusion they had stirred. Mark's absence lingered in the apartment like a shadow that refused to fade. Small, ordinary objects carried weight, an extra mug in the cupboard, an empty side of the closet. Ethan resisted the urge to fill the void quickly. He understood now that rushing toward comfort had been part of the problem. Loneliness, he was learning, was not something to outrun but something to understand. Work felt different too. The new schedule surrounded Ethan with people again, conversations overlapping, phones ringing, life moving forward without pause. Yet he carried the lessons of the night shift with him. He listened more carefully, spoke more honestly, and noticed when he was tempted to withdraw. Emotional distance, he realized, often began as a defense. Occasionally, Ethan thought of Daniel. Not with longing, but with clarity. Their connection had been real, shaped by shared vulnerability and timing. It had not been wrong in feeling, but it had been dangerous in context. Ethan accepted that truth without resentment. Some people entered your life not to stay, but to reveal something you needed to see. One afternoon, months later, Ethan encountered Daniel by chance at a nearby cafe. The meeting was unexpected, brief, and unremarkable to anyone watching. They exchanged greetings, asked polite questions, and spoke about work in neutral tones. The ease between them surprised Ethan. There was no tension, no regret, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what was no longer possible. As they parted, Daniel smiled and said, "Take care of yourself." The words carried no hidden meaning, just sincerity. Ethan returned the sentiment and watched Daniel disappear into the crowd. The encounter confirmed what Ethan had begun to believe: closure did not require grand conversations, only acceptance. That evening, Ethan reflected on how easily emotional neglect could distort judgment. He thought of the subtle choices that had led him to the edge of betrayal and the courage it had taken to step back. Infidelity, he had learned, was not always a single act, but a series of moments where honesty was postponed. Ethan did not emerge from the experience transformed overnight. Growth was slower, quieter. It appeared in the way he now addressed discomfort directly, in the way he refused to ignore emotional distance when it surfaced. He resolved to speak sooner, listen better, and remain present even when connection felt difficult. As the story of those nights settled into memory, Ethan understood that change rarely announced itself dramatically. It unfolded through awareness, through endings that created space rather than closure. His life moved forward not because everything had been repaired, but because he had learned to recognize his own responsibility in what had broken. The night shifts had ended, but their impact remained. Ethan carried forward a clearer understanding of himself and the boundaries he needed to honor. Whatever relationships lay ahead would be shaped by that awareness. And though the future remained uncertain, he stepped into it grounded in a truth he could no longer ignore: real connection demanded honesty, even when it came at a cost.